Ravenwood Cemetery was a place shrouded in legend, a sprawling graveyard nestled on the outskirts of a small town, where the air was always thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It had stood for centuries, its iron gates rusted and its headstones weathered by time. The cemetery was a maze of narrow pathways, overgrown with ivy and lined with gravestones that leaned precariously, their inscriptions fading into obscurity. Towering oak trees cast long shadows across the graves, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. For years, locals had spoken of the strange occurrences that took place within the cemetery's confines. Whispers of ghostly apparitions, the flicker of lanterns in the dead of night, and the sound of mournful cries carried on the wind were all part of the lore. Few dared to enter Ravenwood after dark, but those who did rarely emerged unchanged. One cold autumn evening, a young woman named Emma found herself standing at the entrance of Ravenwood Cemetery. She had come to the town to research its history for her thesis, drawn by the tales of the haunted graveyard. The sun had long since set, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Despite the unease that settled in her chest, Emma pushed open the creaking gate and stepped inside. The air was colder here, and the silence was deafening. As she made her way deeper into the cemetery, the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath her boots. The wind rustled the leaves above her, and every now and then she thought she heard a whisper, just out of earshot, like someone calling her name from a distance. Emma's destination was the oldest part of the cemetery, where the gravestones were so ancient that they had almost become part of the earth itself. She had read about a crypt hidden deep within the cemetery, a place said to be cursed, where the souls of the damned were said to be imprisoned. Her curiosity was stronger than her fear, and she pressed on, determined to find it. As she walked, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the very air was pressing down on her. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees, and the shadows seemed to twist and move on their own. Emma could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her every step, but she told herself it was just her imagination. Finally, she reached the old crypt. It was a small, decrepit structure, half buried in the ground and overgrown with vines. The stone door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. Taking a deep breath, Emma pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside the crypt was frigid, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. The walls were lined with ancient coffins, their wood rotting and covered in dust. In the center of the room stood a single ornate coffin, untouched by time. A strange light seemed to emanate from it, casting an otherworldly glow across the crypt. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the coffin. The light grew brighter, and she could hear a faint whispering, like a chorus of voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch the lid, but before she could, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, without warning, the lid of the coffin began to move on its own, sliding open with a groan. Emma stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. From the darkness within the coffin, a figure began to rise, a tall, shadowy form with hollow eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. The figure stepped out of the coffin, its movements slow and deliberate. Emma was frozen in place, unable to tear her eyes away from the creature before her. It reached out a hand, long fingers ending in sharp, claw-like nails. The whispers began again, louder this time, echoing off the walls of the crypt. Who are you?" Emma managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The figure paused, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. When it spoke, its voice was like the rustling of dead leaves, dry and brittle. "I am what you seek," it said, "and I am your doom." Before Emma could react, the figure lunged at her, its claws slicing through the air. She screamed and turned to run, but the crypt door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. The air grew colder and the walls seemed to close in around her. The whispers became a deafening roar, and the figure loomed over her, its shadow stretching across the floor. In her final moments, as the darkness closed in, Emma realized too late that the legends of Ravenwood Cemetery were not just stories. They were warnings, and she had ignored them, to her peril. The last thing she saw was the figure's hollow eyes, burning with a cold, malevolent light as it descended upon her. The next morning, the townspeople found the cemetery gates wide open, the wind howling through the trees. Emma was never seen again, and the crypt she had entered was sealed shut, as if it had never been disturbed. But those who walked by on moonlit nights swore they could hear the faint sound of whispers carried on the wind, and the silhouette of a woman standing at the gate, forever trapped in the shadows of Ravenwood Cemetery. Blackwood Cemetery was a place of dread long before anyone could remember. Nestled at the edge of a dense ancient forest, it was where the town of Ravens Hollow buried its dead, a tradition stretching back centuries. The cemetery was vast, a sprawling labyrinth of crumbling tombstones, towering crypts, and mausoleums so old that their inscriptions had been worn smooth by time. The air around Blackwood always seemed heavy, as though the weight of the countless souls buried there had permeated the very earth. There were stories about Blackwood Cemetery, whispered among the townsfolk in hushed tones. They spoke of a malevolent presence that prowled the grounds at night, a shadowy figure glimpsed only out of the corner of one's eye. They spoke of strange lights that flickered among the graves, of ghostly voices carried on the wind, and of the eerie, unearthly silence that would sometimes fall over the place, making even the bravest visitors shiver with fear. But the most terrifying story was that of the keeper. The keeper was said to be the guardian of Blackwood Cemetery, a spectral figure who appeared to those foolish enough to trespass after dark. Some claimed he was once a gravedigger who had buried hundreds of bodies in the cemetery, only to be cursed to watch over them for eternity after desecrating a sacred tomb. Others said he was a spirit summoned by dark rituals, bound to protect the cemetery from those who would disturb the dead. Whatever the truth, the keeper was feared by all, and no one dared to enter Blackwood Cemetery after sunset. It was on a particularly cold and misty October evening that Eleanor, a young journalist, arrived in Ravens Hollow. She was ambitious, driven by a desire to uncover the truth behind the town's most notorious legends. The stories of Blackwood Cemetery had fascinated her ever since she was a child, and now she was determined to write the definitive article that would bring her fame, and perhaps a little notoriety. The townspeople warned her against it. Old Mrs. Granger, who ran the inn where Eleanor was staying, clutched her rosary and muttered about stirring up things best left alone when Eleanor mentioned her plans. Mr. Harris, the town's historian, refused to speak of the cemetery at all, only shaking his head gravely when she asked about the keeper. Even the local children seemed uneasy when she inquired about the cemetery, their playful demeanor fading into sullen silence. But Eleanor was undeterred. She had faced fear before, both real and imagined, and had always emerged unscathed. She was sure that the stories about Blackwood Cemetery were just that, stories exaggerated over time by the superstitious and the fearful. And so, on the night of the new moon, when the sky was darkest and the town was quiet, Eleanor made her way to the cemetery, notebook and camera in hand. The entrance to Blackwood Cemetery was marked by a pair of wrought iron gates, their bars twisted into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at her as she approached. The gates were old, rusted with age, and they creaked ominously as Eleanor pushed them open. The path beyond was narrow, bordered on either side by rows of leaning gravestones and tangled brambles that clawed at her clothes as she passed. The mist was thick, swirling around her feet like ghostly tendrils, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under her boots. Eleanor's breath came in small puffs of white as she made her way deeper into the cemetery. The air was colder here, and the darkness seemed to press in on her from all sides. She paused occasionally to take a photograph or jot down a note, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. But each time there was nothing but the mist and the tombstones. After nearly an hour of exploring, Eleanor came upon the heart of the cemetery, the ancient mausoleums where the town's wealthiest and most powerful families had been laid to rest. These structures were grand, almost palatial. but they had been abandoned for so long that they had fallen into disrepair. Vines and moss covered their stone facades, and the heavy iron doors were covered in rust. Here the sense of unease was even stronger, and Eleanor couldn't help but feel that she was trespassing on forbidden ground. It was then that she heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened intently, straining to hear, but the whisper faded into the night. Shaking off the unease, she continued her exploration, but now she was acutely aware of the silence around her, a silence so profound that even her own footsteps seemed muffled. As she rounded the corner of one of the mausoleums, Eleanor's flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging her into darkness. She cursed softly, fumbling with the flashlight, but it refused to turn back on. The darkness was absolute, and for the first time, Eleanor felt a surge of real fear. She pulled out her phone, using its weak light to guide her, but the battery was almost dead. Suddenly, the whisper came again, clearer this time. It was a low, raspy sound, like the breath of someone long dead. Eleanor's blood ran cold as she realized that the voice was calling her name. Eleanor. She spun around, shining her phone's light in all directions, but there was no one there. The cemetery was empty, but the voice had been so close as if someone had whispered directly into her ear. She took a step back, her hands trembling, and that's when she saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the light. The figure was tall and thin, draped in a tattered cloak that seemed to blend with the darkness. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but Eleanor could feel its gaze on her, cold and malevolent. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a hand and the whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. Eleanor, leave this place. Panic surged through Eleanor, and she turned and ran, stumbling over the uneven ground. The mist clung to her, slowing her down, and she could hear the figure's footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, echoing through the night. She didn't dare look back, fear driving her forward as she fled toward the gates. But as she neared the entrance, the gate slammed shut with a deafening clang. Eleanor skidded to a halt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She tugged at the gates, but they wouldn't budge. The iron was cold under her fingers, biting into her skin as she pulled and twisted, desperate to escape. Behind her, the footsteps grew closer, each one sending a jolt of terror through her body. She spun around, pressing her back against the gates, her eyes wide with fear. The figure was there, standing a few feet away, its face still hidden in shadow. But now, she could see its eyes, glowing red, like embers in the darkness. Leave, the voice whispered, more of a command now than a warning. Eleanor tried to speak, to plead for her life, but the words caught in her throat. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, her strength fading with each passing second. The red eyes bored into hers, and she felt an icy hand close around her heart. Leave, or join the others. With a final desperate surge of strength, Eleanor threw herself at the gates, pounding on them with her fists. To her surprise, they swung open and she tumbled out onto the road. She scrambled to her feet and ran, not stopping until she was far from the cemetery, the iron gates and the shadowy figure fading into the mist behind her. Eleanor didn't stop running until she reached the safety of the inn. Mrs. Granger was waiting for her, her face pale and drawn as she helped Eleanor inside. The old woman didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. The fear in Eleanor's eyes told her everything she needed to know. That night, Eleanor left Raven's Hollow, vowing never to return. The article she had planned to write was abandoned, the notes and photographs discarded. She couldn't bring herself to relive the horrors she had experienced in Blackwood Cemetery, and the nightmares that followed her were enough to keep her away. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, a group of local teenagers, eager to prove their bravery, decided to explore Blackwood Cemetery. They never returned. The townspeople searched for them, scouring the cemetery and the surrounding woods, but there was no trace of the teenagers. The only clue was a single notebook, found near the entrance with Eleanor's name scrawled across the cover. The notebook was empty, its pages blank, but the townspeople knew better than to question it. They buried it in the cemetery, alongside those who had come before, and the gates were locked for good. But some say that on misty nights, if you stand at the edge of the cemetery and listen closely, you can still hear the whispers of the keeper, warning all who dare to enter. Leave, or join the others.